people who it's not that they are unprofessional about what they do, but they're a little bit more freewheeling and willing to kind of work towards a synthesis of the kind of the business-like impression that people have about computers, and a sort of very avant-garde artist approach, and how can these things be merged in some ways, like. One of the conventions that I go to is this thing called cyber arts, and essentially it's all artists who use computers. And some of the stuff is, there's a whole range of things. It goes from, people who actually fit that kind of stereotype of little dweebish guys who are just dabbling in artistic things, to people who come from way on the outside and more or less dabble in computers, and they're all there's a whole synthesis of approaches in between. There are people who make clothing out of circuit boards, and stuff like that. So there's a whole deconstruction of the normal stereotypes that go with both sides of the equation.
理系的なイメージを抱くのは、人の自由なんだろうけど、he, watches you release an album like Nearly Human. He sees you going on tour with an oldie, but really like Ringo. And, of course, you're obviously very active in your computer affairs. You're not spreading yourself too thin on all fronts, are you?
If I am, I've been doing it for the past 20 years, so it's. I don't think that I'm any more or less active now than about average active now. This past year has been particularly busy, but not even so much in terms of overlapping priorities, because, for instance, when I went out with Ringo, that was 3 months, and that was pretty much all I did. I didn't have the opportunity to do much else because we were traveling every day, and every once in a while I get a couple days off or a week off somewhere to take care of other business. But more or less, I was just a guitar player in a band all summer, and I think that once I got off the road, I had so many things I had to catch up on that I got kind of busy. But under normal circumstances, I always have 2 or 3 things going on at once, and ideally, you want to. In some senses, it's an illusion, because what I really want to do is kind of give direction to some things and then not have to drive them there. In other words, involve other people, delegate responsibility, and get other people to help drive things along. Take care of the day-to-day of these things. So that I guess in some sense it's like someone who's on a board of directors of a lot of corporations. You go to the corporate meetings and you establish direction, and then go off and do something else. So in that sense, it's not as if I'm doing 100% of all the things that I appear to be doing.
Right, and I think it's also important to point out that he's only been a professional journalist for so long and following you only for so long, and maybe just these things appear to be very high profile now, whereas before he hadn't been aware of them.
Yeah, a lot of this stuff is things that I've been working on for many years. The video thing was, I started that in the mid-'70s, and computers, I got involved in that in the late '70s, and so most of these things have been part of my daily existence for a very long time.
ここに20年間そういう生活をずっと He has heard the released promo of your latest endeavor, and the first impression was that, unlike your stuff in the past where you have co-opted the technology to your own ends, it seems like this time maybe the technology seems to have gotten the better of you on certain parts. Have you been told that elsewhere?
Not that specifically. I think that it's a possibility under depending on the criteria you apply to it.
Yeah.
In other words, if you compare it strictly to something like Nearly Human, in which there was little technology at all, it was all live players, then it may be a dichotomy that's hard to resolve. But as you say, if he's only become aware more recently of my involvement with technological issues, then he's probably unfamiliar with the experiments that I've done in which technology definitely did dominate. That was in the mid '70s and things like that. I think that my agenda at this point includes a certain self-conscious contemporary quality, whereas the last couple of albums were almost self-consciously anti-contemporary. They drew on sort of strengths and values that were more they were associated with music from like 20, 30 years ago, when people just played live and there was no multi-tracking or anything like that. And so the leap is quite a leap from there to something where I'm trying to draw on contemporary influences. But the reason why is because since this is ultimately an interactive record, something that goes from sort of like a database of musical ideas down to a specific realization of some subset of those. The project has to succeed on a number of levels. It has to have commercial appeal to a certain degree, because it does no good to simply sell this as an intellectual exercise. It has to be able to translate. It has to be able to expand the audience to a certain degree in several directions, not necessarily in a specific direction, not necessarily just towards a youth audience or something like that, but also to recapture the interest of people who may have made assumptions about the kind of music that I'm doing. And in that sense, there is a certain degree of self-conscious use of technology. There are these sort of techno parts of the record. All of that's designed to give us the broadest possible area of ideas to draw from when a concrete realization is actually made. When some specific number of ideas are used. So it's to put a cap on it, it's a subjective judgment, I believe, on anyone's part about whether the technology is running the show or whether I am. But from my own standpoint, I'm aware of the fact that there are some self-consciously technological things going on, and that's by design. That's not by accident.
It's an extraordinary answer. I never expected you to talk about subconsciously dealing with contemporary elements.
Well, as a producer, I'm forced to. In my own music, I've always maintained certain kind of autonomy, from that, and do whatever happens to come into my head. But this particular record at this time requires an awareness of contemporary musical issues, partly because they are the effect that they've had on the public consciousness makes what I'm trying to do possible. The fact that that sort of hip hop mixes and things where things are sampled and cut up and kind of put together sometimes in a non sequitur manner. The fact that the audience is getting used to hearing this makes it possible for me to do this sort of interactive music concept where song form is deconstructed and manipulated in different ways, and in some cases purposefully mutilated in an attempt to get people to address what are contemporary technological issues, the new hardware that's coming out, interactive hardware and stuff like that.
Rather arresting to find you pursuing what he calls rap.
Mm-hmm.
Is rap something, or hip hop, something you enjoy listening to, or?
My feelings about music from a stylistic point of view are that there are, no matter who's working it, or no matter how popular a particular style might be, 95% of it is probably bad, mediocre to bad. So so I don't prefer hip hop as from a stylistic standpoint so much as I prefer the work of certain people. And I think that for a long time I resisted it in the same way that most of the audience does. Rap still has a very devoted but relatively small audience. And I resisted it probably for the same reasons that everyone else did, and that was because a lot of it was it dealt with a subject matter that just didn't appeal to me. But the size of one's genitalia, or the or how you're going to trounce every other rapper on the block, and all this sort of just crowing and territorial bullying, or fight the power and all this other kind of stuff. And I think that for a long time I didn't really take it very seriously until it started to affect some other musical areas, or take on or absorb styles from other musical areas. In other words, when rap music and R&B music started to merge in bands like PM Dawn or Arrested Development, things like that, then I started to see room for myself in there. It would be completely dishonest to me to dress up in a beret and black leather and combat fatigues, and just go out screaming about I'm a middle-aged family man at this point, So I had to find some room in there, but there's a different kind of freedom in it that you get, because of the fact that the melody becomes less important than, let's say, the rhythm and the quality of alliteration or your ability. One of the challenges of rap music that I started to realize was that for certain kinds of rapper was to see trying to find the most incongruous word to fit into a rap scheme, something incredibly long, anti-disestablishmentarianism or something like that. If you could figure out a way to get that in there, it was like you were scoring points. And so there are elements of that, words that sound stupid when you sing them, but when you speak them or put them in a rap context or form a rhythmic, some kind of a rhythmic motif to put them in, then it gives you certain freedom to say things and build lyric structures that you can't in a normal kind of melodic environment. So that was sort of what got me interested in it, and then of course I had to take the leap and try it, see whether it was fun, and whether I thought that it would effectively deliver or enhance the message of what I'm trying to do. And so in that sense, there's maybe only there's only maybe one song in the whole album where it's strictly rap, where there's no actual singing. So in most cases, it's a mixture of both, and usually the emphasis is more on the singing than on the rap part. And as to whether I'll continue to do it, it's hard to say. I do sort of enjoy the challenges of it. Building interesting rhythmic syncopations and stuff like that. It's different than trying to find a melody line that works for a particular lyric thing. So at this point, I think it will probably become one of the tools that I use in songwriting for a while.
I guess interesting historical footnote would be that the sort of dynamic at work in the wordplay of rap is not unlike what you try to do with onomatopoeia, or else even the Gilbert and Sullivan that you did on
right.
God.
Well, rap is not a new thing either. Right. It's just people take it as being strictly contemporary. But I remember the Last Poets of Harlem. It was just like drums and poetry, kind of shouted out in a very aggressive rhythmic manner, and that was like in the '60s, late '60s and stuff like that. So rap is not that new a phenomenon. It's just that its emergence as a major musical influence is something that's contemporary.
Bill, you, I guess, commented in some interview somewhere that artists like Michael Jackson and Madonna sort of wield this, they have this cult of personality. The music music is sort of a secondary thing.
Mm-hmm.
He was wondering, though, in your particular case, so the persona of the artist is, in your own case, is not that important anymore. It's more just output. Is that all that matters?
Well, in my case, it's not that the persona is unimportant, but if the persona is perceived as following an essentially non-musical agenda while posing as a musician, that's the thing that I have a problem with. My records are not meant to depend on my willingness to promote them in order to succeed on a musical level. At least that's my intention. I mean, it may or may not be true, but since as he's well aware, the last couple of albums that I did were in some senses anti-contemporary and dealt only with things that I really wanted to hear and be party to. So I don't think that in my particular case the personality is completely unimportant, but I think for most people who follow my work, they realize that the personality is very much bound up in the musical explorations that I'm involved in, and not necessarily on a pose that has something to do with sex, or that I'm dangerous or bad, or something like that, Ultimately, I think that I can deliver on all the things that I claim to be involved in, like computers and video and things like that. I actually work in those. I don't simply exploit them. I understand the language of those things. I don't have to necessarily hire a consultant so that I can effectively operate in those areas and translate something that has nothing to do with them per se into those other media. I think my personality, in some sense, evolves from the media that I'm involved in, and in that sense, it's more difficult for me to figure out the personality aspect than it is to figure out the musical aspect. It's easy for me to come up with the music. The hard part is figuring out what I'm willing to do publicly to draw attention to the music. And I think that's the opposite of someone who essentially is a personality artist, who first says, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to adopt this dominatrix persona, and take photographs of S&M photographs and stuff like that, and I'll put out a record that goes with it, and I'll hire some songwriters and producer, help me put it together, and essentially, sell an image. And I always hope to somehow find the image within the works that I've already done, and then figure out a way to draw attention to it.
The last two albums you've stressed a couple of times were sort of anti-contemporary.
Mm-hmm.
Now you've gone full swing the other direction,
mm-hmm.
into the realm of high tech. What are the implications of this on your live performance, upcoming live performances? Will we be able to hear acoustic versions of your songs like you've done before?
Well, those are issues yet to be resolved in some ways. I think it's dangerous to make a half commitment to what I'm trying to do. In other words, I think the likelihood of me doing what might be a very high-tech, what will probably be a very high-technology, multimedia-oriented show, and then suddenly say, okay, everyone, forget all that, I'm going to sit down here and play acoustic guitar for a little while. I don't know that that's going to work. I think that at a certain point I might have considered it, but I saw the U2 show recently, and that's what they attempt to do, and essentially it destroyed the dynamic of the show, to my mind. They came out like gangbusters to the point that the first half hour of the show, you weren't even listening to the band. You realized half hour into the show that you hadn't been paying attention to the band. You've been paying attention to all the other stuff that was going around, and the band was kind of soundtrack to it. And you weren't even evaluating the quality of the performance per se. Of course, it's difficult in any case to evaluate fine points of a performance in the Dodger Stadium, but But what they did, kind of like an hour or so, hour and 10 minutes into the show, is they decided to become an acoustic band. Because I guess they figured people, weren't going to be that high tech. Now, I think the audience, was enthusiastic and responded to everything they did, no matter what it was. But my own particular response was that they had somehow done something that I felt was very self-conscious, even in what was already a self-conscious context. And that was, we're being too high-tech here, we got to go out and, play congas and acoustic guitars and sing a couple of tunes. And not that the songs were bad or that they wouldn't have been pleasing in another context, but in this particular context, I thought that it was not successful, And so I may be able to find a way to incorporate something that depends less on the technology into my show, but I don't want to have that sort of a lack of commitment to the concept to the extent that you feel almost like a politician, like you feel obligated to please everyone all the time. I don't want to have that sort of political attitude about the performance, so I can't promise that there'll be anything that's simply there for the sake of continuity with the last two albums or something like that.
The two questions come at once. First of all, what bands or artists are you interested in now? Secondly, do you have the confidence to actually popularize this type of interactive, that's the word used, but that sort of form? Do you have the confidence to popularize that sort of format?
We'll take the second question first because it's easier, and the answer is yes. That I've made a public commitment to take the arrows in the back for this particular concept, for better or worse. And it's only because I have made that commitment that the other participants, Philips Interactive Media, and other people who are doing interactive devices, have made the commitment to me. So the answer to that is simple. That's for the foreseeable future. That's what I'm committed to is public awareness of this concept, and also validating it from an artistic standpoint, making it more than a technological curiosity, but an actual valid listener experience. As far as listening to bands, I go through phases all the time. Up until maybe 9 months ago or something like that, I was listening almost exclusively to old jazz.
When you say old jazz, how old do you mean?
I mean like from the 60s and 50s and 60s. Pre-fusion jazz. Then I would make a regular habit of watching this program on MTV called 120 Minutes.
That's actually the alternative.
It's the alternative. Yeah. It's like a 2-hour show on late Sunday night.
Right,
it's like midnight Sunday. And it's like the alternative ghetto. It's something like it's like the last possible fragment of programming time left in the week. So they gave it over to essentially college radio type stuff. So when I listen to the radio or when I watch anything on MTV, it's usually alternative music or bands that are really new, and many of whom only last maybe a couple of months or a year before they sink back into obscurity. Just to see what's to keep in touch with what people are doing. And there are a couple of bands whose work I thought was really affecting and may have had some degree of influence in what I'm doing. For instance, bands like Urban Dance Squad, Curve, nothing out of Manchester.
Exclamation point.
Exclamation point, yeah. Public Enemy, PM Dawn, various kinds of more contemporary records that have a greater synthesis of ideas. Family Stands. Usually, most of what I listen to has either a high conceptual thrust to it or a heavy black influence to it. I don't listen to heavy metal at all. I don't listen to pop music or country music really at all. I don't listen to, white dance music, and I don't really listen to techno music that much. But I was in another band or another concept that I thought was really successful, and that had a degree of influence on me was KLF as well, because it was something that was invented out of thin air, a very high concept aside from the music and the way that they. I think the KLF could be considered in some ways seminal influence of what I was doing, because they managed to recycle what they were doing in so many different ways that it made me think, well, why not be able to do this in real time? Why not be able to, have the record resynthesize itself, while you're listening to it, rather than have the band go back in the studio and mix it again for you to get a different version. So I kind of took that, what they had done, and combined it with the technical knowledge that I had to come up with this interactive music concept.
Okay.
People who it's not that they are unprofessional about what they do, but they're a little bit more freewheeling and willing to kind of work towards a synthesis of the kind of the business-like impression that people have about computers, and a sort of very avant-garde artist approach, and how can these things be merged in some ways? Like one of the conventions to help drive things along, take care of the day-to-day of these things, so that I guess in some sense it's like someone who's on a board of directors of a lot of corporations. You go to the corporate meetings and you establish direction, and then go off and do something else. So in that sense, it's not as if I'm doing 100% of all the things that I appear to be doing.
Right, and I think it's also important to point out that he's only been a professional journalist for so long, and following you only for so long, and maybe just these things appear to be very high profile now, whereas before he hadn't been aware of them.
Yeah, a lot of this stuff is things that I've been working on for many years. The video thing was, I started that in the mid-'70s, and computers, I got involved in that in the late 70s. That I go to is this thing called cyber arts, and essentially it's all artists who use computers. And some of the stuff is, there's a whole range of things. It goes from, people who actually fit that kind of stereotype of little dweebish guys who are just dabbling in artistic things, to people who come from way on the outside and more or less dabble in computers, and they're all there's a whole synthesis of approaches in between. There are people who make clothing out of circuit boards, and stuff like that. So there's a whole deconstruction of the normal stereotypes that go with both sides of the equation right now.
まあ、美形的なイメージを抱くのは、その自由なんだろうけど、he, watches you release an album like Nearly Human. He sees you going on tour with an oldie, but really like Ringo. And, of course, you're obviously very active in your computer affairs. You're not spreading yourself too thin on all fronts, are you?
If I am, I've been doing it for the past 20 years. So it's. I don't think that I'm any more or less active now than about average active now. In the past, this past year has been particularly busy, but not even so much in terms of overlapping priorities, because, for instance, when I went out with Ringo, that was 3 months, and that was pretty much all I did. I didn't have the opportunity to do much else because we were traveling every day, and every once in a while I get a couple days off or a week off somewhere to take care of other business. But more or less, I was just a guitar player in a band all summer, and I think that once I got off the road, I had so many things I had to catch up on that I got kind of busy. But under normal circumstances, I always have 2 or 3 things going on at once, and ideally, you want to. In some senses, it's an illusion, because what I really want to do is kind of give direction to some things and then not have to drive them there. In other words, involve other people, delegate responsibility, and get other people to